Welcome, friends. Before we begin, if these family stories speak to you about love, pride, and sometimes the ache that sits between, hit subscribe, tap the bell, and share where you're listening from. Today's title, The Graduation Shame. Let me tell you how it happened. I was 58 that afternoon, standing under the brick arch of Jefferson High's gym, the June sun bright enough to make the asphalt waver like a mirage. The parking lot smelled of cut grass and sunscreen. Families streamed past me, fathers in pressed shirts, mothers in summer dresses, kids wrapped in red gowns with tassels flicking their cheeks. Someone laughed. Someone called out, "Don't be late." They're lining up. I'd come straight from work. Steel-toed boots, paint-smudged shirt jeans, rubbed thin where 1,000 needles had scraped them smooth. My hand still held the faint chalk of mortar, the kind that lingers in your fingerprints no matter how hard you scrub. I'd planned to change, I swear it. But the job ran long, and the clock doesn't wait for a man who works with his hands. I told myself it didn't matter. A father's pride, I figured, shines brighter than any suit. Then I saw him. My boy. He was with his friends, all shoulders and future, and a smile I recognized from 100 little victories, first bike, first base hit, first on a paper we worked through at the kitchen table. He glanced up, caught my eye, and for a heartbeat, I lifted my hand a little wave, like I used to at the fence of the baseball diamond. He broke away from the group and came to me. He didn't hug me. He didn't even touch my arm. He leaned in, lowered his voice, and cut with a blade I never saw coming. "Dad, don't come inside. You'll embarrass me with those clothes." I thought I'd misheard. The band inside was warming up brass, blaring a proud practice note, and maybe the sound bent his words. My mouth opened. Nothing came out. I looked down at myself, and for the first time all day I didn't see work. I saw dirt. Stains. A man who hadn't changed because he'd chosen to pay for the last textbook instead. He stared at the gym doors over my shoulder, swallowed hard, kept going. "Please, just wait outside. Everyone's parents are dressed up. I'll tell them you couldn't make it." Couldn't make it. My chest tightened like a fist. The words landed heavy as a cinder block. I nodded because he was my son, and because nodding was easier than yelling, and because the lump in my throat refused to move. He turned and walked away. The tassel on his cap swung with the rhythm of someone who belonged. He didn't look back. A mother brushed past me, perfume sweet as bakery frosting. Somewhere behind the doors, an announcer tested the microphone check. I rested my palm against the cool iron of the gate, the way you touch a wall to steady yourself when the room tips. Heat lifted off the parking lot in soft waves. I could hear applause starting inside, scattered and polite, the kind that says, "Here we go." When my boy was little, he used to climb into my lap and trace the scars on my knuckles, each one a story, each one proof that a roof stayed on in a windstorm, a basement stayed dry in spring. "You're strong, Dad," he'd say, marveling like I was one of those comic book heroes. Back then I was. Back then he believed the world was carried on the backs of men in boots. I stayed outside, shoulder pressed to brick, like maybe the wall could hold me up if my legs gave out. A few people glanced my way with that look, half pity, half curiosity, then turned back to the ceremony they were allowed to enter. I could smell hot dogs from a cart by the field. I heard a baby cry, a grandfather clear his throat. I heard the cheer when the graduates began to march, the shuffle of 100 gowns like a red river moving toward the stage. My shirt clung between my shoulder blades. Sweat or shame, I couldn't tell. I saw my reflection in the trophy case by the door. A tired man, the kind who knows where a beam should sit and how to make a crooked house stand straight again. I raised my hand, flattened it against the glass. The fingerprints looked like dusted ghosts. If you'd asked me a year ago what I'd wear to my son's graduation, I'd have said whatever makes him proud. Funny thing about pride, it doesn't always look like a tie. Sometimes it's a shirt with your name stitched over the pocket and a ring of keys that never stop jingling. Sometimes it's a wallet that opens even when it shouldn't. From inside, the principal's voice boomed slow and ceremonial. The crowd quieted the way crowds do for important words. I could picture the rows of chairs, one with my son's name taped under the seat in blue painter's tape. I could picture the empty space next to him, the one where a father should sit. "Don't come inside." The words replayed tinny like an answering machine message you can't erase. You'll embarrass me. I looked down at my boots. The laces were clean. I'd tied them twice. My hands were clean too underneath the work that never quite leaves. And still, I stood on the wrong side of the door, a man watching his own life through glass. The band struck a brighter chord. The gym erupted in cheers. And somewhere in that noise, something inside me cracked, not loud, not dramatic, but the quiet kind of breaking you feel in your ribs. I took one step back from the doorway, then another. The sun pressed hot against my neck as I found the shadow of the bleachers and stood there a father with an empty seat waiting on the other side of a wall. I didn't cry. Not yet. I just listened to people clap for a boy I loved more than my own breath and tried to figure out when love became something you had to hide. The ceremony went on without me. From outside the gym, I heard the muffled roll call of names, each one swallowed in waves of applause. My son's name came too. It lifted for a moment sharp and proud, and I imagined him walking across the stage, shaking hands, holding that diploma like a passport into a better life. The kind of life I'd broken my back to give him. I wanted to cheer. I wanted to shout his name into the Colorado sky. Instead, I stood alone in the shadow of the bleachers, listening to the echo of 100 voices celebrate, none of them mine. The clouds had been gathering all afternoon, but I hadn't noticed until the first drop hit the back of my hand. Then another. Soon the June sun was smothered and the smell of wet asphalt rose thick and sharp. I didn't move. Couldn't. I just let the rain soak through my shirt, plastering the fabric against my shoulders. It felt like a baptism into some new life I hadn't chosen. My mind wandered backward because that's what hearts do when the present hurts too much. I remembered the nights spent welding and sanding, finishing double shifts because the tuition bill had come due. I remembered him asleep on the couch when I stumbled home, the glow of the TV flickering across his face, his math homework spread across the coffee table. I'd scoop him up, carry him to bed, and whisper promises I couldn't always afford, but always kept. I remembered his science fair project, how he'd wanted to build a solar-powered car. He was 10. The kit cost more than we had to spare, but I bought it anyway. He won second place, but he acted like it was the Nobel Prize. He hugged me in front of everyone that day, told the judges he couldn't have done it without me. So when did that boy disappear? When did the kid who held my hand at the county fair turn into a young man ashamed of dirt under his father's fingernails? The gym doors burst open, spilling laughter and music into the damp air. Families flooded out, hugging their graduates, posing for photos under umbrellas. Fathers buttoned jackets, mothers held bouquets, and kids in red gowns beamed as cameras flashed. I pressed myself further into the shadow, afraid of being seen. The last thing I wanted was for him to catch me there, dripping rainwater, proof that I'd disobeyed his command to stay outside. My chest ached with a kind of shame I'd never known, not for who I was, but for the fact that my own blood wanted to erase me. Through the blur of rain, I caught sight of him. My son. My pride. My undoing. He was smiling, wide teeth, white against the damp sky, his gown already half open, revealing the pressed shirt underneath. Jenna, his girlfriend, slid into the frame, kissing his cheek as her parents lifted an umbrella over the two of them. They looked perfect together, polished, belonging. I wanted to step forward, just one step, to say, that's my boy, that's my son. To tell Jenna's parents about the nights I skipped meals to keep the lights on, about the years I spent kneeling on concrete so he could sit in classrooms. But I stayed where I was, a ghost at the edge of the celebration, watching my life move on without me. The rain turned heavier, drumming against the metal bleachers like an audience clapping for someone else. My boots were soaked through the mud, creeping up my jeans. Still, I stood rooted, unwilling to leave before he did. When they all finally piled into cars and drifted away into the wet evening, I was left in the silence of an empty lot, the smell of rain and exhaust hanging in the air. I walked slowly to my truck, each step heavier than the last. The seat creaked when I sat, water dripping from my hair onto the steering wheel. I didn't start the engine right away. I just sat there watching the gym lights fade in the rearview mirror, and whispered to myself the words I couldn't tell him: I'm proud of you. Even if you're not proud of me, The wipers squeaked across the windshield, smearing rain instead of clearing it. I drove without turning on the radio, the silence inside the truck as loud as the storm outside. The headlights cut through sheets of water, but my mind wasn't on the road. It was back at that gymnasium replaying the words that had gutted me. Don't come inside. You'll embarrass me. They looped in my head like a cruel refrain. Every mile I drove away from that school seemed to stretch the distance between who I thought I was as a father and who my son now believed me to be. The roads I traveled were familiar. I'd driven them thousands of times over the years, rushing to pick him up from soccer practice, hauling lumber for science projects, taking Ellen, my late wife, to her doctor's appointments. Each street corner seemed haunted with memories, and each one pressed a little more weight onto my chest. I stopped at a red light, the rain tapping against the roof like restless fingers. On the corner was the diner we used to visit after his Little League games. He'd always order the biggest milkshake on the menu, strawberry extra whipped cream. I'd watch him laugh with pink mustaches across his upper lip, promising him that someday he'd do great things. And he had. He'd graduated. He was stepping into a world brighter than anything Ellen and I had ever known. But the cost of that climb, I realized tonight, was me. Somewhere along the way, his ladder to success had left me at the bottom, covered in dirt and grease and clothes he thought weren't good enough for him. The light turned green. I didn't move. Behind me, a horn blared, pulling me back into the present. I pressed the accelerator, the engine groaning like it too carried the weight of my sorrow. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the house looked smaller than I remembered. Maybe it was the storm clouds pressing down, or maybe it was the emptiness waiting inside. The porch light flickered as I stepped out, rain dripping from the brim of my cap. Inside, the air was stale with silence. No balloons, no music, no celebration, just the faint smell of sawdust and old coffee. I hung my wet jacket on the same nail I'd hammered into the wall 20 years ago when Ellen said we didn't need anything fancy, just something that worked. Her photo sat on the mantel, the one where she was holding our boy as a baby, both of them laughing eyes crinkled with joy. I stood there, dripping water onto the floor, and whispered to her picture. He told me I'd embarrass him. The words cracked something open inside me, and for the first time in years, I let the tears come. They burned hot against my rain-cold cheeks, each drop a mix of anger, grief, and something deeper, shame I didn't deserve but carried anyway. I sat in the old recliner, the one Ellen used to curl up in with her books, and let the storm outside drown out the storm in my chest. My hands, calloused from decades of work, trembled as I reached for the folded paper on the side table. It was the scholarship donation form from the school, the one I'd quietly signed months ago. His diploma might bear only his name, but I knew the ink behind it had been written in my sweat. Tonight that thought didn't comfort me. It cut. Still, a small ember of something stirred as I stared at Ellen's picture, resolve, faint but steady. If my son thought I was nothing more than an embarrassment, maybe someday I'd remind him who had carried him this far. And when that day came, it wouldn't be in the shadows. I woke the next morning to the sound of the alarm clock that hadn't been set. My body, trained by decades of early shifts at construction sites, refused to sleep past dawn. Sunlight pushed its way through the blinds, casting pale stripes across the worn carpet. I sat at the edge of the bed, elbows on my knees, and stared at my hands. They were cracked and calloused, fingers stiff from years of hammering, lifting, carrying more weight than any one man should. These hands had built houses for other families. These hands had framed roofs, laid foundations, carried lumber through blistering summers and freezing winters. But most of all, these hands had carried my son's future. The kitchen table bore witness to that truth. I pulled open the drawer where I kept old files, bills stacked and rubber-banded, some yellowed with age. Tuition receipts from the state university, each one a mountain I had climbed alone. 4 years of payments, nearly $50,000. Every zero on the page was a reminder of the double shifts I'd worked, of nights I came home too tired to eat but forced myself to anyway because Ellen wouldn't let me skip dinner. I ran a thumb over the ink of one receipt, remembering the day I'd made the final payment. Ellen had kissed my cheek and said, "Max, you've given him wings." I'd smiled, too exhausted to answer. Back then, I believed wings meant freedom, not distance. Beside the receipts was a thinner folder, wedding expenses. $32,000 for a single day, one that felt like a lifetime ago. I'd told Kylan that I could afford maybe a quarter of that, but he had looked at me with those pleading eyes I could never refuse. And so I worked Saturdays, Sundays installing hardwood floors for cash under the table. My body ached, my back screamed, but the thought of my son dancing with joy on his wedding night kept me moving. "Dad, you're the best," he had whispered after the ceremony. I believed him. I believed every word. Then came the mortgage. I pulled out the thick envelope of statements, 20 years of monthly payments. The house he lived in, the roof that sheltered him through storms, the walls where he studied, laughed, cried, all paid for month by me. By the sweat that soaked through my shirts, by the nights Ellen massaged my shoulders when I thought I couldn't go on. I sat back, the papers spread before me like evidence in a trial. My trial. My life's work laid out in numbers, in ink that couldn't tell the whole story of sacrifice, but came close. And yet, despite all of it, my son had looked me in the eye last night and said I was an embarrassment. That my clothes, my roughness, my years of labor were something to hide. I closed the folder slowly, my jaw tight. The shame was his, not mine. He didn't know it yet, but someday he would. Someday these receipts, these bills, these statements would not just be numbers. They would be the truth he could no longer run from. Ellen's picture caught my eye from the mantel. I walked over, fingers brushing the frame, and whispered I kept my promise. I gave him everything. Maybe too much. Her smile in that photo seemed to soften, as if she knew the burden I carried. That morning, as the coffee brewed and the house settled into its familiar silence, a seed of thought began to form, small, dangerous, and undeniable. If my son thought I was invisible, if he wanted to erase me from his life, then perhaps one day I would remind him of the weight of what I had built. And I would make sure he learned it not in private whispers, but under the brightest of lights. The morning passed in quiet, but not in peace. I carried the folders back to the kitchen table and left them stacked neatly, as if their order could hold back the storm rising in my chest. My coffee sat untouched, the steam curling upward like a ghost. Around noon, a soft knock pulled me from my thoughts. It was Mrs. Langley, my neighbor of 30 years. She stood on the porch with a small plate of cookies, her gray hair tucked under a scarf. "Thought you could use some company," she said gently. Her eyes searched my face, and I realized she had probably heard the raised voices outside the gym the night before. News traveled fast in small communities. I invited her in, though I felt bare, exposed. She looked at the stacks of papers on the table, the receipts and bills I hadn't yet put away. Her gaze lingered, then she touched my arm. "You carried that boy on your back, Max? Everybody knows it. Don't let his words cut deeper than they should." The kindness in her voice was almost too much. I swallowed hard and managed a small nod. She left soon after, but her words stayed. Everybody knows. Later that afternoon, I walked down to the corner store. Mr. Patel, the shopkeeper, greeted me with his usual warm smile. "Max, haven't seen you in a while. How's your son? Big graduation day?" "Yes." My throat closed before I could answer. I forced a smile, murmuring something vague, and quickly bought the few groceries I needed. But his words cut in a different way. To him, to the town, I was the proud father of a graduate. Nobody had seen me standing outside the doors, shut out by the very boy they congratulated. On the way back, I stopped by the church. Father Thomas was sweeping the steps, his cassock brushing against the stone. He straightened when he saw me, his brow creasing. "Max, my friend, you look burdened." I hesitated, but something about his steady presence loosened my tongue. I told him not every detail, but enough. The words my son had spoken, the way he had looked at me as though I were dirt. Father Thomas listened without interruption, his broom resting against the wall. When I finished, he sighed. Children forget too quickly the sacrifices that built their lives. But the walls of this town remember. The people remember. And the God who saw you work all those years remembers too. He placed a hand on my shoulder, firm and reassuring. You may feel invisible to him, but you are not invisible to the world. That night, as I sat by the window watching the streetlights flicker on, I thought about what they had all said, the neighbor, the shopkeeper, the priest. Each in their own way, they had confirmed what my heart knew: I had not lived my life in vain. The years of work, the nights of sacrifice, The money spent, the sweat shed, it was seen, witnessed, remembered. But my son had turned his back on all of it. He had chosen to erase the very man who had built his foundation. I leaned back, the darkness pressing against the glass, and whispered to myself, there will come a day when he won't be able to erase me. Not in silence. Not in front of others. He will see, and so will everyone else. And with that thought, for the first time in days, I felt not just grief, but resolve. The days that followed were different. I no longer wandered through them half asleep, nursing wounds that no one could see. Instead, I moved with a strange focus, as though every step mattered, every detail had to be remembered. I began with the boxes. In the attic, tucked behind Ellen's old sewing machine and a stack of yellowing newspapers, were cartons filled with my life's proof. Tuition receipts from the university, mortgage slips for the house that gave my son a bedroom larger than the one I grew up in, bank statements showing the checks I'd written when he couldn't keep up with his rent during grad school. I laid them out across the dining table in careful rows like exhibits in a courtroom. Each paper was a nail hammered into the story of my sacrifice. Each number was a reminder that I had carried him further than he ever could have gone on his own. As I sorted, I thought of the words he had said at the graduation, "Don't come inside. You'll embarrass me." They echoed in my ears like a gavel slamming down. Embarrassment, that was the weight of my labor, my devotion, my sweat. To him, I was just an old man in dirty clothes. But these papers, they told the truth. And one day soon he would hear it, not whispered in a kitchen, not muttered in shame, but declared in a place where everyone could see. That evening, Rosa stopped by. My sister had a knack for arriving just when I needed grounding. She sat across from me, her sharp eyes scanning the rows of receipts and folders. "Max," she said softly, "what are you doing with all this?" I met her gaze steady for once. "I'm making sure the world remembers what I gave. If he wants to erase me, he'll have to erase all of this too." Her lips pressed together, a mixture of sorrow and pride. "Do you mean to confront him?" "Yes," I said simply. "But not in anger. In truth. One day when he stands before people, he respects when he thinks the world only sees him. That's when he'll see me. That's when they'll all see me." Rosa reached across the table, her hand resting on mine. "Make sure you do it not just for revenge, but for yourself. For your dignity." That night I placed the files into a large leather binder Ellen had once bought me for work. The cover was worn, but the spine held firm. It felt right, as though the story of our family, my sacrifices, her wisdom, was finally being bound together in one place. As I closed the binder, I thought of Ellen's voice, that gentle warning years ago, "Don't give him so much that he forgets to be grateful." He had forgotten, but the world hadn't, and I was about to remind him in a way he would never escape. I stood in the quiet of the living room, the binder heavy in my hands, and whispered, "The storm is coming, son. And this time, I won't be standing outside the door." It was weeks after the graduation, but the words still burned in my chest. Yet while my wound remained open, life for my son seemed to move on without a hitch. I watched from a distance as he settled into his new job at the marketing firm I had once called in favors to help him land. He walked taller now, shoulders squared with the confidence of a young man who thought he had built his own success. When I drove by his apartment one afternoon, I noticed the brand new car in the driveway, sleek, imported, and certainly not paid for on a beginner's salary. He and his fiancée, Jenna, lived like royalty in that little apartment, posting pictures of fancy dinners and wine tastings, online smiling, as though their good fortune had appeared out of thin air. Never a mention of the man who had taken on extra shifts, who had eaten cold sandwiches in his truck just to pay for the tuition that had carried him to this very point. The first crack came in the form of a phone call. He rang one evening, his voice casual, practiced. "Dad, I might need a little help with the down payment on a new place. Jenna and I are looking at condos closer to the city. It's really an investment, you know." I listened, the binder of receipts heavy on my lap. He didn't ask if I was well, didn't wonder if I had enough for myself. He asked like it was expected, like I was a faucet he could turn on whenever he was thirsty. "Let me think about it," I told him quietly, my voice even. I could almost hear his sigh of annoyance before he smoothed it over with a forced chuckle. The second crack appeared at a family gathering. Rosa had invited us both to her house for Sunday dinner. I arrived in my work jacket, still faint with the scent of sawdust from a repair job I'd done that morning. My son and Jenna were already there, seated at the table like honored guests. When I walked in, Jenna wrinkled her nose ever so slightly, then leaned close to whisper something in my son's ear. He laughed, not the warm laugh of a boy with his father, but the mocking one of a man who thought himself above another. The meal passed in stilted conversation. He spoke loudly about business ventures, about how some people just don't understand modern finance. I recognized the dig. Rosa caught my eye, her lips pressing together in disapproval, but she said nothing. Later, as I helped her carry dishes into the kitchen, she whispered, "Max, he's forgetting himself." I shook my head slowly. No, he's forgetting me. That night, alone in my house, I opened the binder again. My fingers traced the faded ink on the tuition receipts, the hospital bills, the mortgage payments. Each number was a story. Each payment was a step in the life he now flaunted as his own. And in that silence, something inside me shifted. The pain of being pushed aside was still raw, but it was hardening into something else. Resolve. He thought I was just the old man in dirty clothes. But soon, very soon, he would learn that even a man in work boots could shake the ground beneath his feet. The house was quiet that evening, so quiet I could hear the tick of the old wall clock echoing through the room. I sat at the kitchen table where I had balanced bills for decades, staring at the binder of records spread out before me. Pages of sacrifices. Years of my life turned into numbers, receipts, signatures. Proof of a father's love, and soon proof of his son's betrayal. I closed the binder slowly and pressed both palms on its cover. That binder had once been a symbol of everything I had poured into him, his education, his wedding, his rent when times were hard. But now I saw it for what it could become: a weapon. Not one of anger or violence, but of truth. A weapon of memory and of public revelation. That night I walked into the study where Ellen's photo rested on the shelf. Her gentle smile stared back at me, her eyes almost urging me to stand tall. "Don't let them erase you, Max." I could almost hear her voice. "Don't let your years be forgotten." The plan began forming in my mind with surprising clarity. I remembered the school where my son had graduated just weeks earlier. The pride in that ceremony was supposed to be mine, but instead I had stood outside like a stranger. Now I thought, what if my presence could not be denied? What if one day, when my name was spoken aloud in that same hall, he would not be able to look anyone in the eye? I began drafting letters. To the administration. To the scholarship board. I wrote with careful words, not of bitterness, but of hope for the next generation. A scholarship fund in the name of a working man, for students whose parents worked with their hands the way I did. And I would fund it not quietly but publicly. Every dollar I had once set aside for my son's dreams would instead go to children who understood gratitude, children who carried humility in their hearts. I could already picture the moment, the ceremony, when the school principal would announce this year, "Thanks to the generosity of Max, we are proud to award scholarships to deserving students." The applause of hundreds, and somewhere in the crowd my son shrinking lower in his seat, realizing too late what he had cast aside. But I wasn't finished there. I began organizing every financial record into neat files labeled and stacked. Each receipt had a story, and one day those stories would be told. Not in whispers behind closed doors, but in voices that filled auditoriums. From the kitchen window I saw Rosa crossing the yard to bring me dinner. She'd taken to checking on me often, knowing my silence since graduation was not ordinary. When she set the casserole down, her eyes narrowed at the sight of papers scattered across my table. "What are you planning, Max?" she asked gently. I gave her a small smile. "Justice," I said simply. "Not for me alone. For every father who gave everything only to be treated like nothing." Rosa studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Good. About time someone reminded him who you are." After she left, I sat in the dim kitchen long after midnight, the outlines of my plan sharper with each passing hour. For years I had worked in silence, hidden in the background of my son's success. Now I would prepare in silence once more. But this time, the silence was only the storm's gathering. Soon he would face the thunder. "Enough is enough," Max muttered under his breath. his hands trembling as he spread the stack of mortgage papers across the kitchen table. The documents looked more like battle plans now than financial statements. Max Hayes, 58 years old, had spent most of his life as a construction foreman. His hands had built homes for other families, his sweat had kept food on the table, and his long overtime hours had once paid for his son Daniel's college tuition. Since his wife Linda passed away 5 years ago, Max had lived alone in the modest house. He and Linda once decorated with Christmas lights every December. He carried himself with quiet dignity, but tonight, staring at the proof of all his sacrifices, he knew he couldn't fight this battle alone. For too long, Daniel and Jenna had dismissed him as a burden, their words cutting deeper than any injury Max had ever endured on a work site. "Dad, don't come this Christmas. You'll just ruin the vibe." The memory of that sentence still rang in his ears like an iron hammer on steel. But this time, he wouldn't swallow the insult in silence. This time he would have witnesses when the truth came out. He picked up the phone and dialed Rosa, his younger sister. Rosa had always been his anchor, steady, practical woman who had seen her brother sacrifice everything for his family. "Rosa, it's Max," he began, his voice heavy. "I need you here tomorrow evening. I'm planning something, and I'll need you to see it with your own eyes." There was a pause, and then Rosa's voice, soft but steady. "Max, what are you about to do? I'm not letting Daniel erase me anymore. Not after everything. I'm going to make sure the world knows exactly what I've given and exactly how they've treated me." Rosa sighed, but there was fire behind her words. "Then you won't be alone. I'll be there." The next stop was Mrs. Henderson, his elderly neighbor who had lived across the street for 3 decades. She often brought over banana bread at Christmas when Linda was alive, and she had seen firsthand how Max worked double shifts to support Daniel. When Max explained, showing her the receipts, the mortgage slips, and the ledger of all the bills he'd covered for Daniel's household, Mrs. Henderson pressed her wrinkled hand over her mouth. "Lord have mercy," she whispered. "Max, you gave them everything. And they left you sitting alone on Christmas Eve," he nodded. "Well," she said firmly, straightening her back, "then I'll stand beside you. If you're going to reveal this truth, people need to hear it not just from your mouth, but from those who've seen it all these years." Finally, Max visited the small church down the block where Pastor John was closing up after an evening prayer service. The sanctuary smelled faintly of pine and candle wax, remnants of the Advent season. Pastor Max said, his voice low, "I don't ask for much, but I'll need you soon. I plan to tell the truth openly. My son and daughter-in-law have forgotten what family means. I want them to face their actions before witnesses. Before God, if need be." Pastor John studied Max, his weathered face calm but intent. "Truth is powerful, Max. But truth shared in the open can hurt as much as it heals. Are you ready for that?" Max's jaw tightened. "For years I carried their burdens. Paid their mortgage, covered their debts, gave them every chance at comfort. And now they cast me aside like trash. I'm not asking for vengeance, Pastor. I'm asking for justice." After a moment, Pastor John nodded slowly. "Then I'll be there." That night, Max returned home. He spread the documents across the kitchen table once more. Mortgage slips, tuition receipts, hospital bills, wedding expenses, all signed with his name. The evidence was irrefutable. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a lonely widower abandoned at Christmas. He felt like a man preparing for battle. And now he wasn't preparing alone. Rosa, Mrs. Henderson, Pastor John, each of them represented a piece of the community that had witnessed his sacrifices. Max whispered to Linda's photograph on the mantel, "You always told me never let people write over your story. Well, Linda, they're about to hear my story. And this time the whole world will know." The days after my decision were different. The heaviness that had kept me awake at night was still there, but it had changed shape. No longer a weight of shame, it was now a kind of fuel. Every small task I did carried purpose, like laying bricks again, but this time for a different house. A house of truth. I knew one thing: revenge only works when the world is watching. If I wanted my son to feel the sting of humiliation, I couldn't stay alone in my kitchen with binders of receipts. I needed witnesses. I needed allies. So I started with Rosa. She had been by my side since Ellen's funeral, never asking for much, only bringing soup when I skipped meals or sitting quietly with me on the porch when silence was too heavy. This time, when she came by with her knitted scarf for the winter, I laid everything out on the table. The scholarship letters, the receipts, the plans for the ceremony. Her lips pressed together, trembling between sorrow and pride. "Max," she whispered, this will break him." "It's not about breaking him, Rosa," I said softly. "It's about making him see, making him remember who carried him when he couldn't carry himself." She nodded slowly, then took my hand. "Then you won't stand alone. When the time comes, I'll be there." People need to hear what he did. That gave me courage to reach further. At church the next Sunday, I stayed after service and spoke to Pastor John. A man of gray hair and gentle voice, he had known me and Ellen since our wedding day. He listened as I explained not everything but enough how my son had turned me away, how the scholarship was my way of restoring dignity, not just for myself but for others. The pastor's eyes softened. "Your pain is real, Max, and your choice, it carries weight. If you set this in motion, it will be known. It will echo." "Then let it echo," I replied. By the time I left the church, two things had shifted. First, I knew I wasn't alone anymore. Second, I knew this wasn't just about me and my son. This was about every father, every mother who had been told they were embarrassing, too old, not enough. I began contacting a few trusted old colleagues, men who had worked construction with me when my hands were still steady and my back unbroken. They remembered the nights I'd taken double shifts, the mornings I showed up with cement dust still clinging to my hair. When I told them why I was gathering proof, why I was channeling my savings into something bigger than one ungrateful child, they slapped my back and said, "About time, Max." It wasn't just revenge anymore. It was justice. It was legacy. That night, I sat at my desk with Ellen's photo beside me and began writing the final draft of my scholarship letter. Each word carried the weight of sacrifice, the years of love that had been dismissed as an embarrassment. But this time the words weren't for my son. They were for the world. When I finally capped my pen, the house was silent again. But I no longer felt small in that silence. Behind the quiet tick of the clock, I could hear something else, a gathering storm. And this time, I was the one who called the thunder. The morning sun spilled through the thin curtains as I sat at my kitchen table, pen in hand, staring at the blank page before me. For days, the words had been circling in my mind, tightening like a knot that refused to come undone. Now it was time to put them down. I wrote slowly, carefully, as though each word carried the weight of years. To the Board of Trustees and Administration of Lincoln High School, my handwriting was still steady, Ellen's voice echoing in my mind, "Write neatly, Max. Someday people will read your words and remember them." I explained who I was, a father who had worked decades in construction, paying every bill, sacrificing every comfort to raise his son. I didn't hide the pain either. I told them about the graduation ceremony, how I had been turned away at the very door I had dreamed of walking through. I confessed the shame I felt standing outside, hearing the applause meant for every proud parent except me. But then I shifted the letter's tone. Not sorrow, but purpose. I announced my intent to establish a scholarship in my wife Ellen's memory, dedicated to students who came from working-class families, whose parents wore the same stained boots and calloused hands that had carried me through life. I pledged $50 zero, quietly saved over the years, hidden even from my own son. It would go directly to the school, no strings attached except one. My only request, I wrote, is that this scholarship be announced publicly during the next graduation ceremony with Ellen's name attached. Let the students know that love and sacrifice from ordinary parents are never shameful, but honorable. And let them remember that no dream is too far for a child whose parents believe in them. I sealed the letter, placed it in an envelope, and held it against my chest for a long moment. Ellen's face in the photo frame across the table seemed to nod in approval. That afternoon, I walked into the principal's office. He was a stout man in his 50s with tired eyes that brightened the moment he read the first lines of my proposal. As his gaze swept down the page, his lips pressed together, trembling at times, his eyes softening in ways that told me he understood. "Mr. Carter," he finally said, his voice thick with emotion, "this is extraordinary. And it's exactly what our students need. I promise you we will honor this the way you've asked. I nodded, unable to trust my voice. As I left the school, the halls echoed with the laughter of teenagers, the rustle of backpacks, the rhythm of sneakers against linoleum floors. I realized something then: I wasn't just planning revenge anymore. I was carving my legacy into stone. The irony was sharp, almost cruel. The very place where I had been shamed would soon echo with my name, with Ellen's name spoken not in whispers of embarrassment, but in applause. My son would be forced to hear it whether he wanted to or not. And in that moment, I knew this letter was more than paper. It was a spark. And once the fire caught, nothing would stop it from burning. Principal Harris invited me to sit in the small conference room next to his office, a place usually reserved for teacher meetings or disciplinary hearings. The blinds were half drawn and sunlight filtered in stripes across the long oak table. He slid my letter back toward me, the corners smoothed from where he had read it over and over. "Mr. Carter," he said softly, "in my 25 years at this school, I've never received something like this. Your words, they hit me harder than you realize. Do you know how many students here come from families, just like yours fathers, who work double shifts? Mothers who clean houses or stock shelves through the night. You're giving them more than money, you're giving them dignity." His voice caught for a moment, and I could see his throat tighten. Then he leaned in closer, lowering his tone. "And I also understand the personal nature of this. I was there at graduation. I saw you. I saw your son walk past you without even acknowledging the man who built his life with sweat and sacrifice. It broke my heart. For a second, shame and pride wrestled inside me. I shifted uncomfortably, but Harris raised a hand. Don't misunderstand me. What your son did was cruel. But what you're doing now," he tapped the letter with his index finger, "this will echo through these halls for years." We spent an hour going over logistics. He promised the scholarship would be announced during the next graduation ceremony, not as a side note, but as a centerpiece. Ellen's name would be spoken aloud to hundreds of students, parents, and faculty. He even suggested a small plaque in the school lobby, something permanent, a quiet reminder to every student who passed through. I sat there nodding, my hands folded tight. With every detail, I felt a strange mixture of anticipation and justice building inside me. My son would be in that crowd. He would hear Ellen's name ring out, followed by my own, and he would be powerless to stop it. As the meeting ended, Harris placed a firm hand on my shoulder. "I know you've been carrying this alone, Max, but you're not alone anymore. Leave the arrangements to me. When that moment comes, I'll make sure it's done right." I left the school with a new steadiness in my step. The spring air smelled of cut grass and blooming lilacs from the courtyard. For the first time in a long while, I felt like the world was tilting back into balance, not because my son had changed, but because I had. And though the revenge was still quietly tucked beneath the surface, I knew the principal was now an ally in this plan. He had seen my shame, and now he would help turn it into triumph. I whispered Ellen's name as I walked to my truck, the envelope no longer in my pocket but in safe hands. She would be proud, I thought. So proud. The stage was being set. The lights, the audience, the perfect moment of truth. And when the curtain rose, it would be my son, not me, who wished he had never spoken those shameful words. The days after my meeting with Principal Harris unfolded quietly, but not without ripples. Small towns have a way of carrying whispers faster than the wind, and though I had told no one, pieces of the plan seemed to leak into the air like smoke from a chimney. At the grocery store, I overheard two women in the produce aisle murmuring about a big surprise being planned for the next graduation. One of them leaned closer, her voice dropping. "They say someone is funding a scholarship, a father, I think. Supposed to be a real tearjerker." The other chuckled, balancing a bag of oranges. "Well, Lord knows these kids need more of that than TikTok fame." I turned away, pretending to study the tomatoes, but my chest tightened. They didn't know it was me, not yet. Still, the thought of my son's classmates, his teachers, and his peers buzzing about a mysterious benefactor gave me a grim satisfaction. The stage was being set more perfectly than I could have hoped. At church the following Sunday, Father Andrews gave a sermon on humility and honor, speaking about how sometimes the people we overlook are the ones who carry us the farthest. His gaze flicked to me more than once. Afterward, he clasped my hand with surprising firmness. Max, the Lord has ways of balancing what men make crooked. Just trust in the timing. I nodded, wondering if he knew more than he let on. Even if he didn't, his words rang true. Timing was everything now. In the neighborhood, little gestures told me the gossip was growing. Mrs. Patterson next door brought over a plate of cookies and said with a twinkle in her eye, "Big doings at the high school, I hear. Somebody's stepping up in a big way." She didn't press, but the way she lingered at the doorway made me suspect she already had her suspicions. Meanwhile, my son seemed oblivious. He strutted around town with his new job title, shaking hands at the local diner, bragging about how connections had gotten him ahead. He never once mentioned me. I was invisible to him. But soon he would not be able to ignore me. At night, I sat at my kitchen table going over old receipts and memories like a general reviewing his battle plans. My son thought he had erased me from his world. What he didn't realize was that his world was about to hear my name louder than ever, etched not in anger but in honor. The whispers in town grew, and though no one pointed directly at me, I could feel the net tightening. Graduation was coming. The crowd would be large. The announcement would be public. And when the truth unfurled, my son's shame would not be whispered, it would be shouted, applauded, celebrated. Justice, after all, needed witnesses. Graduation week arrived with all the anticipation of a festival. Banners hung across Main Street. The town's little diner advertised Congrats class of 24 on its marquee, and neighbors buzzed about which families were hosting the biggest parties. Everywhere I turned, there was excitement everywhere but in my own home. My son Daniel walked taller than ever those days. He had finally stepped into adulthood, at least in his own eyes, and he carried himself like the world owed him its admiration. He barely spoke to me except in clipped, dismissive tones. When he did, it was only to remind me not to show up looking like a construction worker. One afternoon, I overheard him on the porch laughing with his friends. "He doesn't get it," Daniel said, his voice dripping with embarrassment. "He still wears those beat-up boots everywhere. If he shows up at the ceremony, I swear I'll die. I've told him already, just stay home." His friends chuckled, agreeing too easily, as though mocking your father was a natural part of growing up. Inside, I stood frozen in the kitchen dish towel in my hands. His words landed like stones in my chest, each one heavier than the last. Boots. That's what he reduced me to, boots, dirt, sweat. Not the man who worked double shifts to pay tuition. Not the man who kept the lights on the fridge stocked and his dreams alive. Just the man with old boots. He thought I was irrelevant. He thought the world saw me as invisible as a relic of another generation. What Daniel didn't realize was that the very stage he would strut across, diploma in hand, was about to carry my name higher than his pride ever could. In the days leading up to the ceremony, Daniel and his girlfriend Melissa threw themselves into preparations. I watched from the margins as he ironed his gown, rehearsed, walking across the living room with mock gravitas, and even practiced the moment he would shake the principal's hand. "This is my time," he told Melissa one evening, not noticing that I lingered in the hallway. "Finally, people will see me for who I am, not for who my dad is." Melissa giggled, brushing a strand of hair from his face. "They'll all be watching you, Daniel. Don't worry. This is your day." Her words, sweet to him, tasted bitter to me. Because I knew the truth, the applause would not only belong to him. In fact, the applause that mattered most wasn't for Daniel at all. It was for the man he had tried so hard to erase. What struck me most was his ignorance not just of my plan, but of everything I had done. He bragged about student loans he never had to take, about opportunities that had fallen into place as though fate itself had favored him. He never acknowledged the sleepless nights, the sacrifices, or the fact that those old boots of mine had walked him every step of the way here. On the night before graduation, I caught him again, whispering into his phone. His words were half joke, but sharp enough to cut if he shows up in those clothes. I'll tell him to wait outside again. I can't have him ruining the pictures. This is my big day. I sat alone at the kitchen table, the lamp casting a soft glow over the folder in front of me. Inside it were the signed documents, the scholarship announcement sealed and ready, my quiet revenge sharpened to perfection. My son believed he had silenced me. He believed that his shame could shrink me into a corner. But tomorrow, in front of the entire town, his ignorance would meet truth. And truth would thunder louder than his mockery ever could. The morning of graduation dawned bright, the kind of summer day that carried the scent of freshly cut grass and promise. I rose early, pulling on a clean shirt, and slacks nothing fancy but respectable enough. My old boots, scuffed and worn symbols of every sacrifice I had made, remained at the foot of my bed. I thought for a long moment about leaving them behind, about buying a new pair just for the day. But no, those boots told my story better than words ever could. By the time I arrived at the school auditorium, families were already gathering, buzzing with pride. Mothers held bouquets, fathers carried cameras, children ran between rows of folding chairs. Everywhere I looked, people embraced, laughed, and posed for pictures. I slipped into a seat in the back corner, out of the spotlight, my presence unnoticed by most. Up front, Daniel stood with his classmates in their gowns, the deep navy fabric swaying with each movement. His cap sat slightly crooked, but his smile was straight and confident. He scanned the crowd, his eyes sweeping past me without recognition, or maybe he chose not to see me. Either way, it didn't matter. I was not here for his approval anymore. The principal's voice boomed over the microphone, welcoming parents, families, and friends. Applause rippled through the hall. Then came the speeches, short ones from the valedictorian and the school board president. They spoke about ambition, resilience, and the future, words that rolled over the crowd like warm waves. But I hardly listened. My focus was on the thick folder beneath the principal's lectern, the one that contained my quiet gift. As the names began to be called, students walked across the stage, each one greeted by applause, flashes from cameras, and the proud cheers of their families. When Daniel's name was announced, the hall erupted in noise. Melissa clapped furiously in the front row. His friends whooped and whistled. Daniel straightened his shoulders and walked across the stage with all the grace of someone certain the world was watching only him. He shook the principal's hand, took his diploma, and bowed slightly, soaking in the moment. But the true moment had not yet come. I sat still, my hands folded tightly together, my heart hammering. Around me, families continued to cheer for their graduates, oblivious to the storm about to roll in. My eyes lifted to the banners that read, "Congratulations, Class of 24, in bold letters, and I thought about all the years of sweat and sacrifice that had led to this point, not just for Daniel, but for me. When the principal returned to the microphone, his voice shifted, growing more formal. Before we close tonight's ceremony, he announced we have a very special acknowledgement. The room quieted. Parents leaned forward. Students exchanged curious glances. This year, our school received a generous gift, the principal continued, one that will change lives for generations of students to come. An anonymous benefactor has donated a scholarship fund valued at $100 to support hardworking graduates who may not otherwise have the means to pursue higher education. Tonight we reveal the name of that benefactor. The silence was so deep I could hear the shuffle of my own breath. Then the principal read the words that would echo across the auditorium like a bell. This scholarship is dedicated to the memory of Ellen Hayes and the legacy of her husband, Mr. Maxwell Hayes. The hall erupted into gasps and whispers. All at once, hundreds of eyes turned toward me. The principal gestured toward the back. "Mr. Hayes, would you please stand?" I rose slowly, my boots scraping against the floor, my shoulders steady. Applause began soft at first, then swelling into thunder. Families rose from their seats, clapping, cheering, honoring the man they had thought invisible. My name rolled through the hall, not Daniel's. My story, not his, commanded the stage. And up front, I saw my son's face fall, his smile vanish, his chin drop as shame washed over him. He lowered his eyes, unable to meet mine. The ceremony had begun, but the lesson was only just unfolding. The sound of clapping filled the auditorium like rolling thunder. It wasn't polite applause anymore. It was the kind of ovation people reserve for heroes. People stood up row after row until nearly the entire hall was on their feet. The cheers swelled, bouncing off the rafters, echoing through the walls, and for a fleeting moment I thought I could almost hear Ellen's voice in the roar, soft but proud, "Max, they finally see you." I stood there quietly, letting it all wash over me. My calloused hands, scarred from decades of lifting bricks and laying concrete, trembled slightly at my sides. But I didn't bow. I didn't wave. I simply looked around, absorbing it, not as a performance, but as acknowledgement. For years, my sacrifices had been invisible, unnoticed by the very people I gave them for. And now, before an entire community, they could no longer be denied. I caught sight of Melissa, my daughter-in-law, sitting frozen in the front row. Her painted smile had melted away, her clapping hesitant and forced. She glanced toward Daniel, searching for a cue on how to react. But Daniel didn't move at all. My son sat in his chair, rigid as stone. His hands stayed in his lap while the people around him stood tall. His classmates slapped him on the back, congratulating him, mistaking his father's honor for his own triumph. But Daniel didn't look at them. His gaze was fixed on the floor, jaw tight, eyes narrowed. For the first time that night, it wasn't me who looked ashamed. It was him. The principal's voice rose above the ovation. Mr. Hayes has shown us all what true sacrifice and devotion look like. His hard work built not only his own family's foundation, but now extends to generations of students who will walk these halls. Let this be a reminder: gratitude is the bridge between sacrifice and legacy. Those words cut sharper than any reprimand I could have given. They weren't directed at Daniel, but the truth in them landed like a hammer on his chest. I could see it in the way his shoulders sank, in the way his eyes flicked briefly up toward me, then dropped again. The applause lasted nearly a full minute, but in Daniel's silence, that single minute felt like an eternity. Everyone clapped louder, as if determined to make him feel the weight of it. His father, the man he'd shoved aside in shame at the door, was now being celebrated as the embodiment of love, sacrifice, and dignity. When the ovation finally faded, I sat down quietly. My heart was pounding, but my face remained calm, almost solemn. I didn't need to say a word. The room had already spoken for me. And in that heavy silence that followed, Daniel shifted in his seat, pulling at his gown, adjusting his cap, anything to avoid looking at me. He wanted to disappear, but there was nowhere to hide. Not tonight. The applause was mine. The silence was his. The ceremony ended with the usual flourish, caps tossed into the air, cheers echoing through the gymnasium, cameras flashing like fireflies. But beneath the noise, there was a shift in the air I could feel in my bones. The attention wasn't on the graduates as much as it was on me. Not because I had sought it, but because the truth had finally broken through. As the crowd began to file out, I stayed seated for a moment, steadying myself. My chest rose and fell with slow breaths. This wasn't the kind of victory you shout about. It was the kind you let settle quiet and deep, like rain soaking into dry soil. Then, as I stood, something unexpected happened. People began to approach me. The first was an older teacher, a man with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He extended his hand firmly. "Mr. Hayes, I taught Daniel in freshman English. I just want to say you've done something remarkable. Not just for him, but for this whole school. That scholarship fund will change lives." I shook his hand, feeling the sincerity in his grip. Before I could reply, another voice chimed in. "Sir, you're an inspiration." A young woman, one of Daniel's classmates, smiled shyly at me, holding her diploma tight against her chest. "I wish my dad could be here like you." And then another. And another. Hands reaching out, voices praising, faces filled with respect. A group of parents even paused their own celebrations to thank me, some with tears in their eyes. "You've shown us what fatherhood really means," one said. "Your son is lucky even if he doesn't realize it yet." Each word struck me harder than Daniel's cruel ones ever had. Because for the first time in years, I wasn't invisible. My sacrifices had a voice echoed back to me by strangers who understood their worth. I glanced over my shoulder, and that's when I saw Daniel. He stood off to the side, his cap dangling loosely in his hand, his gown slipping off one shoulder. The crowd parted around him like water around a stone. Classmates who had cheered with him moments ago now kept their distance, casting sideways glances filled with pity or worse, judgment. Melissa clutched his arm, whispering frantically, but Daniel's face was pale tight, as if the ground had given way beneath him. Our eyes met for the briefest second. He looked at me, not with the arrogant disdain he'd shown earlier, but with something rawer, something closer to fear. and shame. I didn't hold his gaze for long. Instead, I turned back to the people surrounding me, the neighbors and teachers and strangers who now called me Sir, who treated me with the dignity my own son had denied me. As I walked through the crowd, each step felt heavier, but not from exhaustion. It was the weight of years of silence finally being lifted. The air seemed clearer, the lights brighter. Hands patted my back, voices murmured blessings, and for once I didn't deflect or downplay it. I accepted it. By the time I reached the exit, the ovation of earlier had been replaced with hushed admiration. People whispered my name, nodding as if I'd carried a torch through the darkness and shown them the way. And Daniel, my boy, was left standing in that same darkness, surrounded by everything he thought he wanted, but utterly alone. I didn't need revenge in words. The crowd had delivered it for me. The house was quiet that night, too quiet for a day that had been so loud with applause and whispers. I sat in the living room with only the soft glow of the lamp and the tick of the old clock on the wall. My cap and gown memories had long since passed, but I couldn't stop replaying the scene from earlier, the eruption of clapping, the crowd chanting my name, and Daniel shrinking in his seat like a boy who'd lost his place in the world. I poured myself a small glass of whiskey. The ice clinked against the sides, a sharp sound that filled the silence. For years I'd kept my head down, worked double shifts, worn the same work boots until they gave out all so Daniel could stand tall where I had stooped. Tonight, for the first time, the balance had shifted. People saw me not the worn clothes, not the calloused hands, but the man behind them. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the mantel. Ellen's photograph smiled down her eyes, warm and knowing. "You'd have been proud today," I whispered. "You'd have known this wasn't about revenge, not really. It was about dignity." But even as I said the words, I knew part of it was revenge. Sweet, undeniable revenge. And it tasted better than any whiskey. The phone buzzed on the table beside me. Daniel's number lit up the screen. I let it ring. His voicemail would fill with apologies he didn't mean, explanations he'd crafted, excuses that would fall apart the moment I asked a real question. I had no appetite for them. Not tonight. Outside, the summer air was heavy with the scent of cut grass and fading lilacs. Somewhere in the distance, fireworks cracked, a leftover celebration from graduates who still had innocence in their eyes. I stood at the window watching the bursts of light scatter across the sky, thinking of how fleeting applause can be, how fast cheers turn to silence. And yet tonight wasn't fleeting. Tonight was a mark in stone. They would talk about what happened in that auditorium for years. Not because of Daniel, but because of me. The father who came in work clothes, humiliated at the door, and then rose higher than anyone expected. I sat back down and opened the old leather folder that still smelled faintly of sawdust and machine oil. Inside were receipts, faded photographs, letters from Ellen, reminders of a life built brick by brick. I spread them across the table like a map of sacrifices, each one leading to the man I had become. I wasn't ashamed anymore. Not of my clothes, not of my labor, not of the life I had built with my hands. The shame had been passed tonight, and it rested firmly on my son's shoulders. As midnight crept in, I turned off the lamp, leaving only the moonlight filtering through the window. The house, for once, felt like it was breathing with me instead of against me. I climbed the stairs slowly, carrying Ellen's photograph with me, setting it gently on the nightstand. "Justice," I murmured, pulling the blanket over my shoulders. "You'd have liked that, Ellen." Sleep came easier than it had in years, carried by the weight of a truth finally spoken and the quiet satisfaction of a man who had reclaimed his dignity. The sunlight streamed through the thin curtains, brighter than usual, as though the world itself wanted to remind me that something had changed. I rose earlier than I normally did, my body still humming from the energy of the night before. My hands, though weathered, felt steady, and for once there wasn't that dull ache in my chest. The kettle whistled in the kitchen, and I poured myself a cup of coffee, black the way Ellen used to drink it. I sat at the small kitchen table, the same one where I had calculated Daniel's tuition bills years ago, the same one where Ellen and I had counted pennies late into the night. This morning, though, the table felt lighter, as if it no longer carried the weight of my regrets. The quiet didn't last long. A car engine pulled up outside, tires crunching on the gravel driveway. I didn't have to look. I knew it was Daniel. The knock on the door came fast and hard, not the tentative knock of a child visiting his father, but the desperate pounding of a man trying to salvage what he'd broken. "Dad," his voice cut through the walls. "Dad, open the door, please." I sipped my coffee, letting the bitterness roll across my tongue before standing. Slowly, deliberately, I walked to the door. When I opened it, Daniel stood there, his hair unkempt tie, loosened eyes red from either lack of sleep or too much shame. "Dad, we need to talk," he said, voice cracking. "Please." I stepped aside. "Come in." He walked into the living room, the same room where he had once played with toy trains on the rug where Ellen had read him bedtime stories. But today the room seemed to turn its back on him, as if even the walls remembered his words. "You'll embarrass me." He paced, running a hand through his hair. "Last night what you did, it blindsided me. The whole school, the whole town knows about it now. Do you realize how that looked? How it made me look?" I set my coffee down. Yes, I do." He stopped, stunned by my calmness. "Dad, I didn't mean what I said at graduation. I was nervous, overwhelmed. You've always been there for me, you know that." I just what I asked, my voice steady. "Just threw your father away because his clothes weren't good enough, because his hands were stained from the work that paid for your degree." His jaw tightened. "It's not like that. I just didn't want people to see me," I finished. "The man who worked himself to the bone to make sure you stood on that stage." He looked down, unable to meet my eyes. Silence stretched between us, broken only by the tick of the old clock on the mantel. Finally, he said, "You humiliated me, Dad, in front of everyone." I stood, feeling a strength I hadn't felt in years. "No, Daniel. You humiliated yourself the moment you told me I wasn't worthy to sit inside that auditorium. What I did last night wasn't revenge, it was truth. And the truth always finds its way out." His lips trembled. I just didn't want to look like me," I asked again. "Son, someday you'll understand that there is no shame in being a man who gives everything for his family. But there is shame in forgetting it." He swallowed hard, his eyes glossy. For the first time, I saw doubt, real doubt, crack through the mask of pride he wore. I picked up Ellen's photo from the mantel and held it between us. "Your mother always told me not to give you so much that you forgot to be grateful. Maybe I failed at that. But last night reminded me who I am. And who I am is not a burden, not an embarrassment. I am your father." Daniel's shoulders slumped. He had no words left. He simply nodded weakly and turned toward the door. As he left, I didn't stop him. I knew this was a wound that would take years to heal if it ever did. But I also knew one thing with certainty: the balance had shifted. For once, he was the one walking away in shame, and I was the one standing tall in my own home. By morning, the story had spread faster than the winter wind that swept through our small town. I didn't need a newspaper to tell me. The whispers came on their own, through phone calls, through neighbors, stopping by, through the way people looked at me when I walked down Main Street to buy bread. At the bakery, Mrs. Turner leaned across the counter, lowering her voice so the whole shop could hear. "Max, we all heard what you did at the graduation last night." Her eyes softened, a mixture of pride and pity. "Took courage. Not many fathers would have done that." I offered a polite nod, embarrassed by the attention but warmed by the respect in her voice. "Just told the truth, that's all." But it wasn't just whispers anymore. At the grocery store, two clerks were chatting near the produce aisle, not realizing I was only a few feet away. Can you believe it? The man paid for the whole scholarship fund and nobody even knew. His own son tried to push him away like he was nothing. And then the principal read his name for everyone to hear. "That's the kind of story that'll stick." "Shows you," the other said, shaking his head. "Respect doesn't come from clothes or status. It comes from what you give." I slipped past them quietly, but inside my chest something unfamiliar stirred vindication. For years I had carried my sacrifices in silence, thinking no one saw and no one cared. But now the whole town knew. That afternoon I walked into the diner where Ellen and I used to have Sunday lunches. Heads turned the moment I stepped inside. Some nodded, others smiled. A few even clapped lightly against the tabletops. Mr. Parker, the waitress, said, beaming, "Your coffee's on the house today. And thank you for showing us what real fatherhood looks like." I sat in my booth, hands wrapped around the steaming mug, and let their words wash over me. For once, I wasn't invisible. I wasn't the quiet man sitting in the back row. I was the father who had given everything, and finally people saw it. But while the town whispered admiration for me, it whispered something very different about Daniel. At the hardware store, I overheard two men discussing him. "Imagine telling your father to stay outside his own son's graduation," one said, disgust lacing his voice. "What kind of man does that? The kind that forgets where he came from?" the other muttered. "And from what I hear, the old man built everything they've got." Daniel's name, once spoken with pride for his academic success, was now carried with shame. People shook their heads when it came up, their tones sharp, their judgment clear. He wasn't the promising graduate anymore. He was the boy who had humiliated his father only to be humiliated in return before the entire town. That evening, Rosa, my sister, came by the house. She set a pie on the counter and hugged me longer than usual. "You should have seen the faces at church today," she said. "They're all talking about how brave you were, how wrong Daniel was. It's about time people saw what you've done for him." I smiled faintly, though my heart still ached. "It's not about me being brave. It's about him finally facing the truth." Rosa squeezed my shoulder. "Truth has a way of spreading, Max. You gave him a lesson no one will let him forget. He'll carry this shame for years, and maybe, just maybe, it'll change him." As the night settled in, I sat on the porch, listening to the town's hum drift through the quiet streets. The whispers had become a chorus, one that lifted me but weighed heavily on Daniel. For the first time, the balance of power had shifted. I wasn't the burden anymore. He was. It was 3 days after the graduation ceremony when Daniel finally came to my house. I had been sitting on the porch, rocking gently in the old chair Ellen used to favor, when I saw his car pull into the driveway. It was the same car I had co-signed for him years ago, the payments I'd shouldered when his credit had nearly collapsed. The sight of it brought a bitter taste to my mouth. He stepped out, his gown and cap long gone replaced with a wrinkled shirt, and a face tight with shame and exhaustion. For once, he wasn't carrying that proud, cocky air. Instead, his eyes darted nervously, as if every shadow on the street was watching him. Perhaps they were. The whole town had been whispering. "Daddy," said, his voice low, strained, "we need to talk." I didn't answer immediately. I just rocked the creak of the chair, filling the silence. Finally, I gestured to the other chair across from me. He sat, but not easily, like the seat itself judged him. "I didn't know you'd done all that," he began, his words tumbling out quickly, desperate. "The scholarship, the money, I didn't know you were going to do that at the ceremony." "You didn't know," I repeated slowly, my voice measured. "But you knew enough to tell me I'd embarrass you. You knew enough to shut me out." Daniel's hands clenched in his lap. His face twisted between anger and regret. I was under pressure. Everyone's parents were there. I didn't want to look different. Jenna, I cut him off, my tone sharp. "Don't you dare blame this on Jenna. Those words came from your mouth. Words don't slip out unless they're sitting in your heart, son." He flinched, staring at the floorboards between us. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the distant bark of a dog down the street and the rustling of leaves in the summer breeze. Finally, he muttered, "Everyone's talking about me, Dad. At the cafe, at the store, everywhere I go, they look at me like I'm a monster." "That's not my doing," I said, my voice steady. "That's yours. You thought respect came from polished shoes and expensive suits. You thought your old man with his calloused hands and work clothes would stain your image. Well, the town saw the truth. They saw who built you, and they saw how quickly you threw it away." His eyes lifted, then wet with frustration. "So what did you want me to beg you? Want me to get down on my knees in front of the whole town? Is that what this was about, humiliating me?" I leaned forward, my voice low but cutting. "No, Daniel. This was about showing you the cost of shame. I gave you everything, my sweat, my health, my savings. And in return you gave me a closed door at your graduation. You humiliated yourself. I just made sure you couldn't hide it." He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "I didn't mean it like that," he whispered. "But you said it," I replied. "And words once spoken can't be taken back. Now you have to live with them just like I live with every sacrifice I made for you." Daniel sat in silence, his shoulders sagging under the weight of what he'd done. For the first time, he looked less like a son seeking forgiveness and more like a man crushed beneath his own choices. When he finally stood, his voice cracked. "I don't know how to fix this." I stayed seated, my hands folded on my lap. "Then maybe the first step is learning what should never have been broken." He walked back to his car slowly, his head down like a man who had lost more than just respect. And as his taillights disappeared down the street, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Not joy, not sorrow, something colder, steadier. Justice. The revenge was already complete. But the echo of his words, "Dad, don't come inside," would never leave either of us. The Sunday after the confrontation, I decided to go to church. It wasn't because I needed comfort. I had found a new kind of strength in myself, but because I wanted to stand where the truth could not be ignored. The sanctuary was full, as it always was on summer mornings. Stained glass windows sent colored light across the pews, and the choir was warming their voices, the low hum of harmony filling the air. As I stepped through the doors, I felt dozens of eyes turned toward me. People smiled, nodded, some even rose to shake my hand. Max whispered old Mrs. Green, gripping my palm. "What you did for those students, it was the most selfless thing I've ever seen. You should be proud." Proud, I repeated softly, though a part of me still ached. After the service, Pastor Lewis invited me to stand at the front. He wasn't one to single people out, but that morning he did. "Many of you know Max," he said, his deep voice echoing off the rafters. "You've heard the story of what happened at graduation. Let me tell you something true. Greatness isn't measured by titles or appearances. It's measured by sacrifice. And Max here has given more than most men could in 3 lifetimes." The congregation applauded. Some clapped politely, others with a fervor that shook the room. I stood there awkward, my hands clasped in front of me, wishing Ellen could see it. But then, near the back, I saw Daniel. He hadn't expected me to be there. Jenna was beside him, stiff and uncomfortable. Their faces turned red as the applause grew louder, echoing like judgment itself. Daniel looked down at the floor, unable to meet anyone's gaze. Jenna whispered something sharp into his ear, but whatever it was, it only made him shrink further into himself. After the service, people surrounded me, neighbors, parents of the scholarship kids, even strangers who had only heard whispers. They spoke with admiration, gratitude, respect. "You reminded us what family really means," said a man I barely knew. "You showed them that dignity can't be bought," added another. All the while, Daniel and Jenna stood on the fringes, isolated. No one approached them. No one asked about their plans, their future, their success. The spotlight they once craved had become a glare that burned. Later that week, I went to the grocery store. Normally, it was a quiet errand. But now, clerks and shoppers stopped me in the aisles. "Mr. Carter, thank you," one young cashier said. "Because of you, my sister applied for that scholarship." "God bless you," an older man added, clapping me on the shoulder. And then behind me in line, I heard a sharp intake of breath. Daniel. He was holding a basket, eyes darting like a cornered animal. Whispers followed him. "That's the son who turned his back on his father. Imagine treating your dad that way." He abandoned his basket, muttered something to Jenna, and hurried out the door. For once, the community wasn't blind. They had seen the betrayal, heard the truth, and chosen their side. As I walked home with my groceries, the air felt different. Lighter. Not because I had been vindicated in some grand way, but because justice had stretched beyond my walls. The weight of Daniel's shame was no longer mine to carry. It was his, and the world had placed it squarely on his shoulders. And in that judgment I found a strange kind of peace. It was late evening when I heard the knock. At first I thought it was Mrs. Henderson bringing by one of her pies again, but when I opened the door, there stood Daniel. He looked smaller somehow, though he was taller than me. His suit jacket hung loose on his shoulders, his hair unkempt, his eyes bloodshot. For a moment neither of us spoke. The silence between us was louder than any word. Daddy finally muttered, his voice cracking. I stepped aside. He walked in slow, like he wasn't sure if he was welcome anymore. The kitchen light fell across his face, and I saw years of arrogance stripped away, leaving only fear and shame. He sat at the table, the same table where I used to help him with math homework, where Ellen once served her Sunday pot roast. But now he kept his hands folded tight, as though holding them together could keep his world from breaking further apart. "Dad," he began again, "I didn't know it would come to this. People won't even look at me anymore. At church, at the store, at work, everywhere I go, they whisper. They call me ungrateful. A disappointment." His voice caught on the last word, as if it was too heavy for him to carry. I didn't answer. I just studied his face, the way his jaw trembled, the way his eyes avoided mine. "I just wanted a better life," he continued, his tone somewhere between pleading and angry. "Jenna said appearances mattered, that we had to rise above. I didn't mean to erase you, Dad. I thought you'd understand." Understand, the word burned in my chest. I remembered the cold sting of standing outside his graduation, the taste of humiliation at Christmas dinners, the shame of being told I was too old, too poor, too much of a burden. "You thought I'd understand," my voice came out steadier than I felt. "That my years of breaking my back, of putting food on this table, of paying for your education could be brushed aside like dust, that I would nod and smile while you erased me from your life." Daniel's lips trembled. "Dad, please. I can't take it anymore. Everyone hates me. I just want to make it right." For a moment I saw the little boy. He used to be the one who clung to my hand when he was scared of the dark, the one who cried when he scraped his knee, the one who once called me his hero. But that boy was gone, buried beneath years of choices that had carved him into someone else. "You want to make it right?" I said quietly. "Then learn what right is. Learn that respect isn't about appearances, that love isn't about money, that family isn't something you choose to show off when it suits you." He leaned forward, desperate now. "Tell me what to do. I'll do anything." I shook my head. "No, son. That's the problem. You think redemption is a transaction like paying a bill or signing a contract, but some debts aren't paid with words or gestures. Some debts are carried." His face collapsed at my words, and for the first time I saw true pain in his eyes. Not the pain of being judged by others, but the pain of realizing he had done this to himself. He pushed back his chair, unsteady, as though the weight of my words pressed down on him. "I don't know if I can carry it," he whispered. "You'll have to," I said softly. "That's what it means to live with consequences." He left without another word, his shoulders bent, his figure swallowed by the night. I stood at the window long after he disappeared down the road, my chest heavy with sorrow, but also with truth. For the first time, I wasn't the one begging to be seen. He was. And that was the breaking point. Christmas morning came quietly that year. The world outside lay hushed beneath a blanket of snow, the kind that softens every sound and makes even the harshest corners of life seem gentle. I stood by the window of my modest home, the warm glow of the tree lights casting a soft radiance over the room. The chair across from me was no longer a symbol of absence. It was a reminder of freedom. I no longer sat waiting for someone who would never come. Instead, I shared the table with Rosa, with Mrs. Henderson, and with a few friends from church. They brought casseroles and laughter, their voices filling the house with the warmth I thought I'd lost forever. As we ate, I thought about the long road it had taken to get here. The betrayal, the silence, the public humiliation. All the pain had carved a path, and at the end of it was something I hadn't expected: peace. Daniel had come to me broken, his arrogance stripped away, and though my heart still carried sorrow, I no longer carried shame. The community had seen my sacrifices. They had applauded when the truth came out. And that night by the fire, when I burned away the weight of the past, I realized something important. Revenge wasn't just about punishing those who wronged me. It was about reclaiming myself. I lifted my glass, and everyone at the table followed. "To family," I said. "The ones we're given and the ones we find." A murmur of agreement circled the room, glasses, clinking, eyes shining with gratitude. Later, when the laughter faded into the night, I stepped outside into the snow. The air was crisp, the stars scattered across the sky like blessings. I whispered a quiet Merry Christmas to the memory of Ellen, to the family I'd once built with my own hands, and to the man I had finally become again. I was no longer erased. I was seen, and for the first time in many years, I felt truly whole. If this story touched you, I ask you kindly subscribe to the channel, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and let us know your thoughts in the comments. Your support keeps these stories alive. From my family to yours, I wish you health, peace, and the warmth of true love this holiday season. May your home be filled with laughter, and may your heart always remember you are never alone.